let me tell you, it's really nice to be back here on campus. It's nice to see Daniel. It's particularly nice to see 5 of the students that we had in the fall. And if it is in fact true that I was more energized at the end of the semester than I was at the beginning, I'm not entirely sure that is true. But if it was true, it was because of students like the 5 of you who are here, because you were an absolute joy to have in class, and I enjoyed the class thoroughly. I hope you guys did as well. Let me talk a little bit about what Holy Cross sort of did for me and what it still does for me. And it's a lot of it is emotional, a lot of it is practical. But I guess what I have to start with is the era in which I was here. I was here from 1968 to 1972. Holy Cross was in many ways the same place then that it is now, in many ways a vastly different place. Most obviously it was all male. The first women, the first very brave women entered Holy Cross that fall of 72, one of whom I believe is John Roberts' wife. And I had the occasion to sit with her at a dinner in Washington one night, and we learned of our Holy Cross connection. 1968 to 1972 was one of the more impactful periods of our recent history. And I mean, I remember at times feeling as if the whole world was falling apart. I mean, in April of 1968, Martin Luther King was killed. 7 weeks later or 8 weeks later, Bobby Kennedy was killed. August of 1968 was the Democratic Convention in Chicago, which is very commonly referred to as a police riot, in which demonstrators wanted to express their opposition to the war, and Mayor Daley and others were determined to not let the demonstrators take over the convention. And so the scenes that played out in front of the world really were scenes that were quite distressing in terms of what we think of as America. And one of the things that the demonstrators chanted as they were being beaten by the Chicago police was, "The whole world is watching." And that was profound in my opinion. So then after that I come to Holy Cross. And Holy Cross in some ways, at least in 1968, was a bit of a respite from that. It was not intensely political. We had a small group of students that formed a Students for a Democratic Society chapter on the campus called the SDS, which was the very much left-leaning subset of the Holy Cross population. There was also the formation of a chapter called Young Americans for Freedom, which was very much the right of center members of the student body. But then in December of 1969, there was an episode that radicalized the Holy Cross community. Radicalized is perhaps too strong a word. Certainly heightened the political awareness of the Holy Cross community, and that was the visit of a recruiter from Dow Chemical to come to the campus to try to get graduates to come work for them. Dow Chemical was one of the manufacturers of Agent Orange, which was one of the principal weapons used in the Vietnam countryside, and not only killed Viet Cong, but also killed an enormous number of just Vietnamese people trying to live out the conflict. And so there was a protest. Holy Cross students protested the the presence of the Dow Chemical people here, and I don't remember the exact number of students that were arrested, but the vast majority of the students that were there were white, as was the case with Holy Cross. The vast majority of the students who enrolled here were white, but the majority of the students who were arrested by the Worcester police were African American. That caused the African American students to, I think, quite legitimately assert that this was an example of de facto racism, and so they met over the course of several very emotional days, and they ultimately decided, the African American students, of whom there were maybe 50 or 60 enrolled in the entire campus, decided to, in effect, renounce their status as Holy Cross students. And so there was a ceremony is too strong a word, there was an episode in which they, one by one, handed in their Holy Cross IDs, and with backpacks on their backs and suitcases, they left the campus. This caused the student body to align in solidarity with the African American students, and it caused the faculty to refuse to teach in solidarity with the African American students. And so the campus was shut down, I think, first week of December of 1969. I'm doing this from memory, so perhaps the second week of December. But anyway, it was before the end of classes, certainly before the start of final exams. And so the campus literally shut down. And we were all given passes in our classes, thank God. And that was the end of the semester ended. But we had a series of teach-ins and a series of sessions in which people came together and really talked to one another about, what it's like to be an African American in a predominantly white society, what it's like to be an African American in a predominantly white school, the kinds of sort of de facto racism that just permeated daily life anywhere you went in the United States of America. And so it was a very, very enlightening experience for most of us, if not all of us. Certainly it was for me. Fast forward now to May of 1970, and there were several, protests all across the campus, all across the country on college campuses. There were marches on Washington to protest the Vietnam War, and then May 4th, 1970, there was a protest at Kent State University in Ohio. The governor of Ohio called out the National Guard. The National Guard opened fire on the students, killing 4 of them. That also was a galvanizing experience for college students all over the country, and college students all over the country went on strike. And so once again, our semester ended on or about May 4th, 1970. I don't remember what day of the week it was, but on or about the 7th or the 8th or the 9th of May. And at the time, our classes went later than they do for you now. Our semester ended yet again. So we didn't finish class, we didn't have final exams. This time we were given the option of taking whatever grade we had at the time, or a pass. Again, thank you. But think about this, think about here we are, and by the way, I don't know whether it's still there or not, but the ROTC buildings used to be the sort of ramshackle buildings across from what used to be the Jesuit residence, Loyola. Loyola is now a dorm, right? Are the ROTC buildings still there? I think they're the art. They're art, okay. Well, there was an enormous peace sign painted on the roof, and I think for years, generations of students repainted that peace sign, but it was first painted there shortly after Kent State. And so again, we had a series of teach-ins and we had a series of gatherings and so on. So here were 2 really, for me at least, galvanizing experiences and eye-opening experiences about how those of us who were raised to be respectful of authority were forced to realize that authority wasn't always right, and that a legitimate function of a thinking person in our society was to question that authority and to challenge that authority when it was unmistakably clear that that authority was being exercised in a fashion that was illegitimate, such as calling out the National Guard and making an order to shoot at gatherings of students who were utterly and completely defenseless. So that was the beginning of a political awakening for me. Now, Holy Cross was a player in this, in that simply I was here, but I was here surrounded by, 2,400 other young men, most of whom had come from similar backgrounds to mine. Holy Cross at the time was more of a regional college than it was a national college. Most of the students were from New England. I was from New York. Most had gone to Catholic high schools. So I don't want to present it as insular or parochial, but it was not quite as, what's the word I want, cosmopolitan, if you will, or as pluralistic as Holy Cross is today. So for all of us, there was this awakening, and it was very, very powerful. And so that helped for me, even though I didn't enter politics until some 30 years after I had left Holy Cross. It shaped for me a political awareness, and it also shaped for me a political orientation. Those of you who were in class this past semester know that I am left of center. That began really during that really, really intense period, for me at least, that began with the assassination of Martin Luther King and then carried forward really until we pulled our troops out of Vietnam, which was, I think, 1974, or yeah, 1974. So, but one of the things that Holy Cross added to that in a really, really important way was how open Holy Cross was to that kind of exploration, that kind of awakening, if you will. And we had faculty who were very, very, insightful and powerful in helping us sort of grope our way towards this new political awareness. And I say new, it certainly was for me. I don't mean to suggest that all of my classmates or all of my schoolmates were perhaps as naive or as maybe even as sheltered as I was coming here. So that was one thing, and that political awareness, that willingness or that instinct to just say, wait a minute, just because you're in charge doesn't mean you're right. That started here. And I would say it was encouraged by people here. Now, one of the things I very quickly learned here and then throughout my professional life is questioning authority without having a basis for a factual basis for doing that, and without having sufficient information to not only ask the right questions, but have enough of a base of knowledge to be able to intelligently assess the answers, was absolutely crucial. I mean, it's one thing to rebel, or to question authority, but if you don't really have a factual basis on which to do it, it's sort of mindless rebellion, and that might be satisfying for a while, but it's not particularly useful. And so what I started moving towards was, not just being, in effect, a healthy and respectful skeptic, but being someone who was going to value the importance of knowing what the hell it was I was talking about, or having reasons that stood behind the political orientation I had. That started here, and it was certainly encouraged here by lots of faculty. We had a much larger Jesuit presence then than exists now. It was encouraged by certainly some, not all, but some of the Jesuits. And we found ourselves in an environment in which we were reinforcing one another, much like the right-wing echo chamber. No, I'm kidding. I'm sorry, Carson. And then the other thing that really did have an impact on me was the Jesuit ethos of education for others. And it reinforced again something that I was raised with. I mean, I was raised in a family of 5 children, and both my parents worked. My father was blue collar, my mother was a social worker, and my mother's still alive at age 95. But so they always made sure that we understood that we had obligations. But Holy Cross really reinforced that. And without fully knowing it, I have gravitated to positions where I got to act on that every day. My first year out of college was, I won't call it a lost year, but I spent time driving a cab, and I spent time washing dishes, and I spent time working in a grocery store. So not what I had in mind. So don't feel pressure, okay? And then I started working at Southampton College the year after I got out. So I was 23 years old, and I got a job in the admissions office, which is the lowest level professional position on a college campus. It was perhaps the only job that didn't require a higher degree and so on. And when you're in admissions, you're in a helping profession. You're helping people gravitate the college choice process. So you're a part salesman, you're part counselor, you're a part public relations person, you're a public speaker, you're all of the different things that the admissions people have to do. But what I found that I enjoyed the most was helping people understand the decision that they were about to make and what they needed to think about in order to make that decision. And by the way, the school I worked at was non-selective. So a lot of what we did was we wanted to make sure that it's students who were thinking about coming to Southampton College. It wasn't so much whether we were going to accept them or not, but it was whether or not they were making a good choice for them. And then after a year, this falls under the heading of right place, right time, the director of financial aid on the Friday of Memorial Day weekend, I'm now 24 years old, walks in and quits, effective immediately. And not Memorial Day weekend, Labor Day weekend. We're about to start, orientation starts on Tuesday, the day after Labor Day. And now all of a sudden we don't have a financial aid director. And since I was one of the few guys that could add and subtract, the president of the college came to me and said, "Tim, can you do this?" So I said, "Sure." So anyway, so at age 24, with 1 year of college experience under my belt, higher ed professional experience, I was the director of financial aid. And if there is ever on a college campus a helping profession, it is to be the director of financial aid. And that really set the tone. I don't want this to sound exaggerated, but in some ways it set the tone for the rest of my professional life, because from that day forward, the day I started as the director of financial aid, really certainly till the day I left Congress, I worked on issues of access and affordability for students who were hoping to get a chance at a higher education, either on the macro level, such as when I was in Congress, how do you set policy, federal policy, so that students can maximally benefit, and also on the micro level, which is a student comes to see me and says, "Hey, I'm $500 short, can you help?" And I spent a lot of my time doing just that. I called it putting out fires, and I would, just whatever I needed to do legitimately to help a student be able to continue to stay enrolled. I saw that as my principal job, and so I saw that as really, at the time I was doing it, I wasn't fully aware of it, but looking back, that was me acting on this notion of education for others. I was using my position to help other people reach the goals that they had. So I was at this college for 29 years. I was there 16 of the 29 years I was there. The last 16, I was the provost, which in the lexicon of the system I was part of meant I was the CEO. Long Island University was a multi-campus university with one president for the whole system, but we had 3 residential campuses that functioned like freestanding colleges, and I was the CEO of Southampton College. So I basically, every single thing that happened on that campus touched my office in one way or another. So, and Southampton College was in a little community called Southampton, New York, my hometown, where I had spent my entire life. And so if one of our students happened to run afoul of the law and found himself arrested at 3 in the morning, the village police would call me and say, hey, Tim, we got one of yours. Can you please come and get him? And so I lived 2 blocks from the police station, so I would go to the police station and I would pour the kid into my car and I would get him back up to his dorm room or whatever. Anyway, but that was, I loved that. I didn't love that. I loved being on a college campus, and principally it's because I really do enjoy the company of students, and what I particularly enjoy about students is their sort of unvarnished irreverence. I think that's I'm a strong believer in irreverence, polite, civil irreverence, but I'm a strong believer in that, and I find that on a college campus, and so I enjoyed being at Southampton College. I wanted to be on a college campus though for the wrong reason. Okay, I loved being here. I loved every second that I was a student here. And so I had this hopelessly naive notion that if I was going to continue that, feeling great about my environment and where I was, well, hell, we work at a college campus if you love being a student, and now I don't have to write papers, and now I don't have to go to class, and so what could be better? I found out very quickly that higher education is a business, particularly private higher education is a business. And so it was not anything approaching the sort of stress-free environment that I thought I might find. Still in all, I derived a joy from being an administrator on a college campus that was different from the joy I derived from being a student here, but still in all, I derived joy. I started thinking about what else I could do with my life. I would say around turning 50. You'll get there and you'll recognize that, you start to think about things. And what I found is that in some ways the very things that gave me such great comfort in my life were also things that I found somewhat restraining. I was, living in the same town, in fact, in the same neighborhood that I grew up in the same neighborhood that my father grew up in, and his father grew up in, and his father grew up in. My family first came to Southampton in the 1600s, so there's a lot of continuity there. And I had been had the same employer for 29 years, and I had the same collection of friends. In one case, my oldest friend, still is my oldest and best friend, is a guy that I was baptized with. We were baptized together almost 69 years ago, and we're still very close. His daughter, by the way, went here. So I started to find that was both, as I said, very, very comforting, but also somewhat restrictive. So I started to think about what else I could do with my life, and one of the things that you do when you're the CEO of a college is you give speeches at graduation. And I had 2 themes to every graduation speech I ever gave. One was the importance of civility, to be civil and respectful and polite and informed in terms of how one goes about conducting one's business, however contentious that business might be. And the other was to take a chance, to be willing to walk in off the sidelines and do something to make your community a better place. And I would always say to students, it really doesn't matter what you do. You could, run for school board, you could coach a little league team, you could volunteer at a soup kitchen, whatever it is, but do something in which you're going beyond your own immediate needs and try to help somebody else with their needs. And so I finally started thinking, hey, maybe it's time I take my own advice. So this was around, this was late 2000, early 2001, George Bush had just been elected president. That gave me considerable pause. And then the person that was elected to be our congressman from that area was in some ways, an even more conservative person than had previously represented our district. Our district, by the way, was, at the time, there were about 45,000 more registered Republicans than Democrats. So it was a district that was not impossible for a Democrat to represent, but a challenge for a Democrat to represent. So I started thinking, you know, I don't like I don't like the direction in which the country's headed. I particularly don't like the way our representative is aiding and abetting an agenda that I thought was taking us in the exact wrong direction. And then I started thinking, okay, you know, what do you do with all this? And then I sort of looked around and tried to assess who else might challenge this guy in the fall of 2002, and I realized I had a fairly open shot, and so I did something which is uncharacteristic for me, which is I'm not a risk taker, but I took a risk. I took an unpaid leave of absence from Southampton College, and which, by the way, was among the more stupid things I've ever done in my life. I mean, it took me literally 15 years to pay down credit card balances because I had my wife and 2 kids, and my wife worked, but anyway. And I decided I was going to run for Congress. I mean, I did all kinds of due diligence. I talked with everybody that I needed to talk to. I made sure I had the backing of my family, my immediate friends. I made sure I had the backing of people that would need to financially support my campaign. And so I basically said, the hell with it, I'm going to do it. And so I did it. And I was very fortunate. I ran a campaign against a guy, and I don't want to relitigate the campaign, and I certainly don't want to trash him. He's not here to defend himself, but he ran a lousy campaign. I mean, he ran a campaign that if he had just ignored me, I wouldn't be here, or I'd be coming back here, every 5 years for my reunion. He should have just ignored me, but he didn't. He decided to go for the kill. He ran this absolutely outrageous, irresponsible, untrue ad about how I was, in effect, pro-rape. I'm not, by the way, but it backfired on him, and it was, so I went from being down 26 points in a poll, and people trying to figure out who the hell this Bishop guy is, to being on the front page of the daily paper for Long Island 3 out of the next 4 days, and all of a sudden the race was a hot race, and the next poll we did, I'm within 1. So, and then from then, he went on to make even more mistakes, and so I wound up winning by 2,000 votes, which was, at the time, the smallest margin of victory for a challenger in the country, and it was much harder to unseat an incumbent back then. It's now somewhat easier. Still being an incumbent is a pretty good gig, but it's a lot harder. It was a lot harder then. I was one of only 4 challengers to beat a sitting incumbent in 2002. 2 of us as Dems, two ours. And so now I find myself in Congress, and I asked to get on the Education Committee because I felt that was what I knew the best, and I thought that was where I could make the greatest impact. And then I got on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee because that was a really, really important committee for our district. And on education, I sort of immersed myself in federal policy as it relates to what are called the Title IV student financial aid programs. I don't know whether any of you get Pell Grants or Perkins loans or Stafford loans or college work study. All those are the Title IV programs, and they're always imperiled. They're always under the gun. And so I was one of a handful of members of Congress who made it our mission to see to it that we protected those programs, and not only protected them, but expanded them. In the 4 years that we Dems were in the majority, '07 through 11, we were successful in passing a couple of pieces of legislation that have shaped the current state of the student financial aid programs and made them more available to students, made borrowing easier, less expensive to repay, made the Pell Grant, increased the maximum award from the Pell Grant, solidified the work-study program, and so on. I'm very proud of that. I was one of the people that wrote that legislation. And it grew out of both my experience at Southampton College, but also my experience here. Because, and again, I found that my college experience, particularly having the benefit of going here, had such an impact for me that I wanted other people to be able to have that same impact. And I wanted people to be able to make a college choice decision without being encumbered by financial factors. That's an ideal, by the way, that is hard to get to, but that was my goal. And then the other thing that members of Congress do, and it's one of the less well-recognized pieces of the job, is members of Congress engage extensively in constituent service, solving individual problems for individual members of your congressional district. And for 8 of the 12 years that I was in Congress, I was in the minority, and it's really, really hard to have a meaningful impact on public policy when you're in the minority. The House of Representatives is very majority driven. The Senate is becoming that way, but the Senate members of the minority still have considerable ability to influence public policy. In the House, it's very hard. So what I decided to do to make, to feel as if my presence in the Congress had an impact is we really threw ourselves into constituent service, and we became really, really good at it. We solved, tens of thousands of problems, and acquired, millions of dollars of veterans benefits that should have been received that weren't received. Hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of medals for veterans, and we kept people in their homes when the the banks were foreclosing. And so we did all kinds of things that were basically solving one problem at a time for one person or family at a time, but taken in the aggregate had a really, really important impact, at least for them. But also, when you think about it, if you keep a family in a home, not only are you helping that family, but you're also helping that neighborhood, because a boarded up home in a neighborhood doesn't do a whole hell of a lot for real estate values. It could be a place where people that, of unsavory interest gather, and, so it had a larger impact than just helping those people. And by the way, this was during the foreclosure crisis. The foreclosure crisis started in this country sometime in late '07 and continued through at its peak through 2010 at least. So we were dealing with literally hundreds of people a month who were in danger of being foreclosed out of their homes, and we dove into every one of them and tried to keep as many of them as we could. So that again is rooted in this notion of education for others, using whatever it is I had and the people around me had, whatever influence we had, whatever ability we had to get people to answer our phone calls and have to call us back if they weren't there. That was rooted in what I had inculcated in me here. I've gone on way too long, I'm sure, but I'm enormously grateful that I got a chance to be a student here. I'll say one other thing that was rooted in my Holy Cross experience. and I think I may have talked about this in class, I don't know. But my father worked for the New York Telephone Company. He was a blue-collar guy. He never went to college. He was an installer, and then he had a job that doesn't exist anymore called a test deskman. And he had 5 kids. And my mother stayed home until my older brother came here. And then she went back to work. But he was a member of what was at the time, the current name of the union is Communication Workers of America. They represent most people that work for the various telephone and communications companies, and they represent lots of other people. And he worked, and I'm not exaggerating, he worked week in and week out, 80 or 90 hours a week, because that's what he needed to do to make enough money to not only see to it that we lived reasonably comfortable lives, but that college was a realistic possibility. And I used to hate the phone company. I hated them because I couldn't understand why they would make this guy with 5 kids work on Christmas, which he did every year. And it wasn't until I was here, I mean, this, again, a slow learner, it wasn't until I was here that I realized he was getting double time and a half, and he was putting in for it. But that double time and a half is what got me to be able to pay the bill every fall and every spring, and my brother and my older and brother behind me, and then my other 2 siblings who went to other independent colleges. And so for me, this place has an enormous amount of emotional resonance because I know the sacrifice that particularly my father, but my mother as well, went through to give us this chance. And I really believe that had I not come here, had I gone somewhere else, my life would have played out differently. And I absolutely know that what got me to be able to go here was how hard they were willing to work. But also, here's the public policy part, how much the protections that the collective bargaining agreement that my father worked under gave to him that then translated into the double time and a half that allowed him to help me come here. So one of the things that I was very focused on was supporting the right of workers to organize and supporting a reasonable minimum wage and reasonable terms and conditions of employment. And I don't think that's an anti-management thing. I think that's a pro-worker thing, and that it's a false choice to say that pro-worker is anti-management. And this is the last thing I'll say. You're probably all on suicide watch, but when my father died in July of 2012, the local CWA local 1108 gave me a framed copy of his union card, and they gave me my own union card, and so that's one of my more cherished possessions. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to see whatever questions anyone has. Thank you.
Thank you for coming to speak. Always a joy to hear you speak, Congressman. I have a question about your time in Congress specifically. I think 2004 was going into your second term, correct?
Second year of my first term.
Second year of your first term. Jonathan Haidt recently came to the college, who is a psychologist, professor at NYU, and his talk was focused on looking at data of political polarization here in the United States. And specifically, his data showed that 2004 was very much a point in U.S. history where you see the 2 parties becoming more polarized here in the U.S. Due to a lot of factors such as the dying memory of World War II, of events in the late 20th century that really brought the country together. I was wondering, while in Congress, if you noticed anything specifically 2004 onward in regards to being more polarized in the House, or if not, what do you potentially see being the force that could bring this country together?
I can't say that I can cite a specific set of events or experiences that would suggest that 2004 was a tipping point. There's no question that over the 12 years that I was there, the Congress became increasingly polarized, angrily so, to the point where we are now, which I would say has gone beyond polarization and has become tribalization. And for me, the tipping point from polarization to tribalization was the entry of the Tea Party class of 2010 in January of 2011. But if you take a broader, and by the way, I'm in no position to question the statistics that he cited or anything. But for me, having talked to a lot of people that had been there a long, long time and done an awful lot of reading, the beginning of the intensity of the polarization was the Newt Gingrich effort to retake the majority for Republicans, which began in 1978 and continued to 1994. And his theory was, which he speaks openly about, is that in order to, he had to do two things. He had to convince the American people that the Congress simply did not work, that it was an entity that did not function and was not living up to its constitutional responsibilities. And so he did that by virtue of creating this monolithic opposition to everything that the then majority tried to do. The other thing that he had to do, and again, he speaks openly about this, was the perception was, and it's less so the case today, is that people thought Congress didn't work, but I like my own congressman. He or she's fine, but the rest of the place, they should blow it up. Okay, he had to fight that, because in order for him to become, for the Republicans to become the majority, you had to get rid of some of these guys that were popular in the district. So this, I don't want to say the politics of personal destruction began with Newt Gingrich. It's been around since George Washington, but it intensified there. And in some ways, you got to give the guy credit. 16 years, and finally, 1994, he achieves the goal of a Republican majority. So the days where Tip O'Neill and Bob Michael would, go toe-to-toe with one another and then go out for dinner together, those days are long gone, long gone. And the other thing that's happened, I think, is it used to be that that if, depending on who was in charge, Republicans or Democrats, I'll forgive this analogy, but it was like moving the ball from one 40-yard line to the other 40-yard line. Now it's moving the ball from one 2-yard line to the other 2-yard line. The chasm between the two parties is so broad now. How do you close that? I think the single most impactful thing that could close it, and it would take a long time for this to take hold, would be nonpartisan redistricting committees. I think if you did away with partisan gerrymandering and did so through appointed nonpartisan redistricting, you would allow for more fair elections, and elections would become less partisan because the populations doing the selecting of the members would be more pluralistic populations as opposed to predominantly R or predominantly D. I think the other thing that we could do, by the way, we think we'll ever do that? No. The other thing that we should do, and I think we'll never do this, is make voting mandatory. Make voting mandatory. So if you no longer had the luxury of conducting a base-driven election, and you no longer had the focus of running an election exclusively on turning out your base, because everybody was going to turn out, because if they didn't, they're going to get fined, then elections would be run much differently, and our politics would become much less extreme on both sides, I think. But like I said, that's a bridge too far, I suspect. I mean, if we can't tell people they got to have health insurance, how the hell are we going to tell them they got to vote, So, yes, sir.
I know you talked about this briefly, but you obviously took a very big risk in declaring for the congressional race as a college administrator against a powerful incumbent. What experiences, either that you received at Holy Cross or at other points in your life, did you use to stay resilient during that uphill battle?
That's a good question. And I know I should have a Holy Cross thing, but what was most resilient, what was the greatest source of my resilience was my family, and I mean they were 100%, 1,000% behind me, and so. And one of the things that's interesting, again, this is very personal, but my oldest daughter, who's now 40, at the time she was 23, was my fundraiser. And she remained my fundraiser the whole 12 years I was in Congress. And what was interesting is we had a complete role reversal. That you know, as she was growing up, and even now, I'm the person she leans on. I'm the person she goes to for support and consolation if she needs it, and so on. During the time that I was running for Congress, and every campaign I had after that, she was the person I went to, you know. And so she was in effect my, you know, my mentor or my rock, which was a wonderful parental experience, you know. So anyway, I'm being very personal. Perhaps I shouldn't be, but yeah.
Thank you very much. My question has more to do with your experience in higher education industry, really, especially your add and subtract business in, as financial aid director at Northampton. I think Jerome here would agree with me that as seniors, we've spent our 4 years here and we've had our own moment of seeing momentum in Holy Cross and seeing that there being more open conversations, more awareness, more students willing to voice their opinions. One of the incidents that I've noticed recently is people's comment on the fact that Holy Cross has dropped need blind admission process. I'm not sure whether you've heard of this. As an international student myself, I am completely outside that system, and I also have a very limited knowledge of how it runs, what it means, and how that could impact students. But I do have close friends who either goes to here, goes to Clark, give me their own experience of how this would impact them. And through that, I learned why they were so strongly against this, because they don't see it as a very Holy Cross thing to do. And given that you had such a long experience being a financial aid director and that you really see it as passionately one of your goals to support the students for higher education opportunities, I would like to know what's your interpretation on this, and how do you think there is a better way, or do you think people is taking this decision somewhere they probably shouldn't?
Okay, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage in that, number one, I wasn't aware that Holy Cross had dropped a need-blind admissions policy. When Holy Cross had a need-blind admissions policy, I thought that was commendable. Where I'm at a disadvantage also is that I don't know, I simply don't have the data to understand the different kinds of financial decisions that the president and the chief financial officer and the board have to make about how you run this place. When I was at Southampton College, it was my job to construct the budget for the campus. It was my job to administer the budget for the campus, to in effect sell that budget to the board, etc. So I had intimate familiarity with what needed to happen to allow Southampton College to open up every day. I don't know that here. So it would be almost gratuitous of me to say they shouldn't have done it, because I don't know what factors drove that decision. But I will simply say that I think for a college of the resources that Holy Cross has, and particularly for a college that has a core of alums that are as spectacularly generous as Holy Cross alums are, that's an unfortunate decision. That's all I'll say. It's a decision that I wish the Holy Cross hadn't made. Let me say it that way. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.